Today's daf we're going to be learning is Horayot daf Gimel. A reminder that we have a new website, a few technical issues. Some are getting sorted, some are still in the works. So patience for the next few days. Hopefully all will be resolved soon. Okay, with that, and then it will be an amazing experience. Okay, we're going to get started with our daf. So to review the main part of what we really have to both get to today, finish up from yesterday, and which is really a bigger idea that came out of yesterday's daf, was that our Mishna started with a case where the Beit Din makes an erroneous ruling. An individual follows that erroneous ruling, not the rabbis. Remember, the classic case in the Torah is the majority of the people. Today we'll talk about majority of what? Who's counted in the majority? Majority of people follow the erroneous ruling of the court. Then they bring a paralim davar shel tzibur. Who's the they is a good question. We're going to talk about, I mentioned yesterday, there's different opinions, but we'll get to that later. So there's a paralim davar shel tzibur. It's a unique bull offering that's brought by, again, community Beit Din, something by the tzibur. We'll call it very simply. Then we have a situation, though, where an individual follows the court or minority of the people follow the court. Now, if that happens, the Mishna ruled very clearly, they're exempt completely, and there's no paralim davar shel tzibur, because that's obviously only communal. And they don't even need atonement on an individual level, right? Which is, like we said yesterday, it's a fascinating concept. And perhaps that's what's pushing Rav Yehuda in the name of Shmuel, or Shmuel we're going to see, to say this is not the only opinion. Wait a minute. There's someone who says they're obligated. Because, again, I just want to be very clear. We're talking about two different sacrifices completely. There's an individual who sins on their own. They have to bring an individual sin offering. There's a community who sins based on erroneous ruling of the court, completely different case. They have to bring a paralim davar shel tzibur. What if you have something in the middle, which is an individual, but who follows the court? And that's the machloket. Did they go back and revert to the original sin offering, the individual sin offering, because they are an individual, they did a sin, they need atonement, this is what there is. There's no communal one. You can't possibly bring the communal one as an individual. That's a unique one. So let's default back to the individual one. To which the Mishna says, no, you're completely exempt. But comes Rav Yehuda in the name of Shmuel, and what's going to be very interesting today is we're going to see that Rav Nachman said in the name of Shmuel, not that it's a machloka Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis, but it's a machloka Rabbi Meir and the rabbis. So we'll get back to that soon. But right now we're on the opinion of Rav Yehuda, who says it's a machloka between Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis. And what we did was we brought a braita, which is a pretty simple braita, 3 miyutim, and that means that the individual, when they bring their sin offering, it's only for the individual, okay? And not for an individual who follows the court. And that was the first one, and that was Rabbi Yehuda. Then we went to this very complicated braita that we read according to Rabbi. We said this matches the rabbis. So I'm going to start now from the part where we reread the braita after kind of trying to figure out what it means. We reread it in the later stage. So I'm going to start from the words Elalav hachi ka'amar. Okay? Mi'ut kahal shechat'u. Okay, now the braita had said, I want to just do this as we go back to the original braita. The original braita starts off, Adayin ani omer. I might have thought, I'm going back to the original for a minute. I would have thought, mi'ut kahal shechatu chayavim. Now, in what case are chayavim? Now, they're going to say two things. They're obligated. Why are they obligated, a minority who does a sin? Because in the case of ein beit din mivi'im al yidei par, if there was a mistaken, erroneous ruling, they wouldn't bring a par. Okay? So, now what does that mean? So, what they want to say like this. Mi'ut kahal shechatu b'shigigat ma'aseh. The first part is, they said, remember before we tried to say the whole thing was Beit Din or the whole thing was not having to do with Beit Din? Now we're going to say it's a combo. If a minority of the people sin on their own, they start doing a sin on their own, you might have thought they'd be obligated, each one, to bring an individual offering, which actually we are. Okay, maybe I wasn't clear. We're starting from yesterday's daf. I'm a bet at the bottom, about 10 lines from the bottom. So, mi'ut kahal shechat'u b'shigigat ma'aseh or chayavim. Why? She'ein beit din mivi'im al yedeihem par b'hora'ah. Because in a parallel case, we're comparing two cases. In a parallel case of a paralim davar shel tzibur, the mi'ut doesn't bring, right? They don't bring anything. You only bring it when there's a majority. This is all to set up, and this is what I said yesterday. I just want to be clear because this is at the end of the daf and it was very confusing. This is all to set up. We're going to make a comparison. The mi'ut has a certain stringency about it, a minority of the people. And that's why you might have thought only they're obligated when they do their own action because of a stringency in a different action. Okay, so in the case where the whole community follows something, there's a paralel davar shel tzibur. And when the mi'ut does it, right, there's no paralel davar shel tzibur, but now this is the big chumrah. When the community does it, the beit din brings the sacrifice, which means the community actually does nothing. When the minority follow the court, what happens? They each have to individually bring a korban. That's the premise of this whole braita. That's what we're trying to prove. If the minority brings, obviously the individual brings. It's all the same thing. So that's the stringency. I'm going to read it again. Mi'ud kahal shechatu b'shigat ma'aseh chayavim. So now you would have thought this pasuk, when it says me'am haaretz, in the individual sin offering, it's coming to talk about the obvious would be it's talking about the minority of the people. If the minority of the people decided we're all going to go eat this piece of chaylev, not because the court said, you would think they'd be chayavim. Now they are chayavim, but that's not what the drasha is going to teach us. It's going to teach us a bigger chidush. Okay? Why would you have thought it's talking about them? Because in a parallel case of the paralel davar shel tzibur, where the mistaken erroneous ruling, mivi'im al yedeihem par ein beitin mivi'im par b'hora'ah. Now here comes the big added words that doesn't say in the braita. Okay? What it says here is the beit din doesn't bring a par, which means, and they're obligated to bring their own sin offering. That's what makes this whole drasha. That's the basis of the drasha. Hahen chayavim. They'll be obligated to bring their own individual offering. Yachol rov hatzibur shasu b'shkagat ma'aseh pturin. Sharei beit din mivi'im aleim par b'hora'ah. Now compare. If the mi'ud, let's start from the beginning. The mi'ud is obligated to bring their own individual sin offering in a paralel davar shel tzibur case, right? Where, again, it's not the tzibur, that's the whole problem. So they bring their own individual. Therefore, if they all decide together as a minority to go do something wrong on their own without the court, they're going to be chayavim. But you might have thought in the parallel case, in the tzibur, since they're exempt from a korban, when they all sin because there is a korban, but the beit din brings it, then you would think that maybe they're also exempt if the majority of the people all decide to go out and eat chaylev on their own. Maybe there's an exemption too. Okay, it's a bit of a weird thing to think about. But in this very unique way of thinking, that the mi'ut has a stringency, that would make sense. Okay, because there is a case where the mi'ut brings a korban and the majority doesn't, and that's when there's the paralel davar, right, when they follow the court's ruling. Talmud lomar me'am haaretz, afilu rubo. But that's why in the individual sin offering it says, one from many. It's to teach you, even many people who do things on their own have to bring sin offerings. Okay, so if the majority of the congregation goes out and decides to eat something non-kosher, right, they all have to bring a sin offering. Okay, their own individual. That's what the drasha is. And it's all premised on that chumrah. So Rav Papa says, I'm Rav Papa mimai, dilma lo hein velo beiti. Now he goes back to the line and understands the line literally. What does it say in the first line there? It said the individual who does something, the minority, who does something on their own, you'd think would be obligated. Why? Because the court doesn't bring a korban for them in the paralel davar shel tzibur case, right? Because they're a minority. Now we understood it as the court doesn't bring, meaning they have to bring. Rav Papa says maybe it just means the court doesn't bring, and there's no korban. Okay. Now, in what I explained, that makes no sense, and that's exactly what they say to Rav Papa. The braita makes no sense if we read it your way, because that's a totally irrelevant piece of information. The piece of information that's relevant is what they inferred. The piece of information that's relevant is they don't bring a korban, right? Because the people have to bring a korban. But Rav Papa's just literally looking at the braita and saying, doesn't say they're chayavim, it just says the court doesn't bring. Court doesn't bring, maybe they don't bring. To which they said, if that's the case, then why is the braita, the whole agenda of the braita is to say the majority of the people do a sin on their own, they have to bring their own individual sin offerings. Is it not because lav michlal de mi'ut b'hora'ah kaimale de machayvu b'hora'ah? Is it not because of what we said? A minority of the people, now this is just going to repeat everything I said before. The minority of the people in a case of a mistaken ruling, they follow the ruling, have to bring their own individual korban. That puts them in a position where we already have a case where minority of people are bringing individual korbans, which doesn't exist by the majority of the people. There is no such thing. So therefore, that's why the braita builds it as you might have thought it's only the minority, not the majority. But if the minority don't have to bring a korban, even in a parallel davar shel tzibur case, then there would be no drasha here, and it would be the opposite. Nehadr bereisha, you would have started in the beginning to look for a source on miyuta demachayv b'shiga maseh, because intuitively, I would think kahal needs korban more than minority needs korban, right? Majority would need more reason for it to atone for them. So it should have started the reverse, and then said, oh, maybe the chiddush is all just about the minority. And then you would later get to the rov. El alav mitelo mahadra al miyuta mechayvim b'shigat maaseh u'b'sof mahadra aruba l'chiyuva b'shigat maaseh shema mina miyut b'horah chayavim in kispa v'sira v'shelo b'horah b'shigat maaseh chayvim. So they're basically just reading the same words. They're saying the fact that they didn't start looking for a source for the miyut, but the miyut was the obvious one, must be based on the fact that a miyut in a hora'ah, when they follow a minority, the people follow the court, they have to bring a korban. The kispan sira is the individual offering. And b'shigat, right? And shelo b'hora'ah, obviously, if they just did it on their own, they're also chayavim. Okay? And that's basically the rabbi's position. So now, because if the minority brings sin offerings when they follow erroneous ruling, obviously an individual is going to bring a sin offering when they follow an erroneous ruling. Okay, I want it to be really, really clear here. I think it's clear, but I want to really clarify, because we're going to talk about this today. We keep wavering between this par halim davar shel tzibur, which is a korban that's brought in very unique circumstances, the erroneous ruling of the court, and then the majority of the people follow. Today we're going to see this big machloket, which actually comes up later, but we'll mention it minorly today, about who brings it. From here it was clear who brings it. The court brings it, because remember we said the majority is exempt because the court's bringing the korban, meaning it comes out of the money of the court or the judges. We're going to see, though, there's a machloket about this, okay? And we think always if the par is one bull offering, we're going to see perhaps it's more, according to some opinions. That's a side point, but that's one offering. Then we have this other offering, which is individuals or individuals of a minority, or now we learn even individuals of a majority, right? That if they sinned, right, they bring sin offerings. So we have individual brings for their own sin, minority brings for their own sin, and both of them also bring, according to the rabbis, that's a big chiddush, a machlokah with Rabbi Yehuda, they also bring this individual sin offering, sometimes in cases where they followed an erroneous ruling, okay? Or not always in a case, right? They follow an erroneous ruling and they're part of a minority of people and not the majority. Every person who sinned has to bring their own individual sin offering, not the bull offering, okay? And then if the majority joined the erroneous ruling, they're not going to bring that individual sin offering. And Rabbi Yehuda thinks that nobody brings an individual sin offering for an erroneous ruling. That's exactly the machloket. Now the Gemara is going to ask, with two lines from the bottom of Bet Amabet, sorry, just the way it is on these dapim, stamet michti travayu stamet nan. Since both these braitas, we said this braita is Rabbi Yehuda, this braita is the rabbis, but it never said Rabbi Yehuda is the author of that braita. It never said the rabbis are the author of that braita. Rabbi Yehuda, but how do you know the first one was Rabbi Yehuda and the second one was that we quoted is the rabbis? Maybe it's the opposite. And now why is it important? Because majority opinion is always important. And it's Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Shmuel is not just saying, by the way, someone disagrees. By the way, the majority of the people disagree. The rabbi's position is a dissenting opinion to the Mishnah. I want you to understand how radical this is. The Mishnah just says one opinion, and comes Shmuel and says, there's another opinion, by the way, okay? And he's coming to say, now he's basing it in source, but even that source you could see was complicated to understand, right? It's not so clear in the end, that's the only way we're able to understand that source. But it was quite a complicated braita to really understand what the pshat of that braita was. And his whole thing, that's why Rav Papa was saying, are you sure that's what it really means? It never says they actually have to bring a korban. But okay. So man shamalei dedarish mi. Now we're going to have two ways of doing this. One is going to be a positive proof that this is, the first one is Rabbi Yehuda, and the next is going to be process of elimination, meaning it can't be Rabbi Yehuda. So the first proof is man shamalei dedarish miyuta ki agavna. The drasha was there's three words, and we can darshan three miyutim from those three words. Okay, there's three unique words that don't need to be there. Each one is teaching us a different halacha. That's Rabbi Yehuda, who does that in general. Titania, as it says in the braita, Rabbi Yehuda, Omel, Zot Torah Ta'olah, he. Okay, Hi'olau Mokdah. This is a different pasuk. We're not going to get into details, but there's 3 miyutim in that pasuk. So this word, this word, that word. Okay, we're going to learn, right? Zot, Haolah, He. That means it's unique, right? We're going to learn 3 unique laws. And that's in the name of Rabbi Yehuda. So there you have it. Similar style. Must be Rabbi Yehuda. Second answer, Ibai Dema. Now we're going to go back to the other braita. The one that we said was the rabbis, the super complicated one. We're now going to read one line in the braita. It won't be so complicated anymore. And say that line clearly doesn't match Rabbi Yehuda because you're going to see Rabbi Yehuda disagrees with it. Adayin and Yomir. Lo matzi mukmilak Rabbi Yehuda. Okay, the braita, this is the words. Right, I can't say. Adayin and Yomer is just a quote. Lo matzi mukmalak Rabbi Yehuda. Those words, Adayin and Yomer, and the continuation, can't possibly be according to Rabbi Yehuda. Why? Tikatani, it says there, Rov kahal shechatu beitim miv'im al yidehem pal. It says the majority of the people that sin, that was the whole premise of everything. When the majority of the people sin, the Beit Din brings the par. Now, I told you there's a machloket about this. Who brings the par? Rabbi Yehuda, ha'amar tzibor hu d'maiteh. According to Rabbi Yehuda, the community has to bring the sin, the people who sinned. Beit Din lo. The Beit Din doesn't bring it. How do we know this? It's not. It's a Mishna later on our Masechet. Rabbi Yehuda omer, shiv'a shvatim shechat'u, mevi'im shiva parim. Okay, one of the ways we determine majority is by tribes. If 7 tribes sinned, that's the majority of the people, they actually have to bring, this is why I told you, you're going to be surprised, it's not just 1 par, they bring 7 parim. According to Rabbi Yehuda, not only the community has to bring, each community. And each tribe is considered a community, and each community that sinned has to bring a korban. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, it's not the Beit Din that brings it, it's the tzibur. So that line of the braita can't possibly be Rabbi Yehuda. If that line isn't, obviously the whole braita is not. That's the first part. Now we're going to move to Rav Nachman that I promised. Rav Nachman, Amar Shmuel, Zo divrei Rabbi Meir, Aval Chachamim Omrim, Yachid Shasab Ora Beit Din Chayav. On the one hand, it's clear that Shmuel thought there was machloket about this. It's just a question of who said it. So according to Rav Nachman, Shmuel actually said it's Rabbi Meir's position, not Rabbi Yehuda's position. Now the Gemara wants to find, where do we see that Rabbi Meir or the rabbis argued about whether the individual who follows an erroneous ruling of the court has to bring an individual sin offering? My Rabbi Yehuda, my Rabbi Meir, or my Rabbanan. Where do we find this? The way the Gemara is going to work right now, we're going to bring a braita. There's very few words in this braita, very unclear what the braita is talking about. We're going to do the same thing we did yesterday, although it's a much simpler braita. Is it this? No. Is it that? No. And then they're going to say, oh, it must be exactly this machloket, Rabbi Meir and the rabbis that we're discussing. Then Rav Papa is going to say, no, you could read the braita this way. And then the Gemara is going to suggest another 3 alternative explanations. And each time we're going to explain that the braita means something completely different, in which case, in the end, we're going to be left with, we don't really have a good source for showing Rabbi Meir and the rabbis argue about this. So, Ditanya. Horu ve'asu. Rabbi Meir poter v'chachamim mechayvim. Okay, 7 simple words. Let's see. Horu, they taught. That's obviously the court. Ve'asu, and then they did according to what they taught. Now, notice it didn't change subject. So the obvious would be the court then did. Rabbi Meir potel, v'chachamim mechayvim. Rabbi Meir exempts, the rabbis obligate. Okay, obviously exempt and obligate in a korban. Now, what kind of korban? Good question. We have 2 possibilities of korbanot. Either the par halim davar shel tzibur, depending on what the details are, or maybe it's an individual sin offering. Now, if we can prove it's talking about the individual sin offering, and it's our case, then it's perfect. Right? Then we have a machloket. Rabbi Meir says you're not obligated. That matches our Mishna. The rabbis say you are, which matches what we said the rabbis say. So, manasu. So here come our rejection of the first 2 possibilities, just like we did in the previous braita. Who did? So, Beit Din taught, and then, ilema Beit Din, if you say the Beit Din did it, there's a machloket. Do they have to bring a korban? Do they not have to bring a korban? Now, one of these opinions makes no sense then, because my tamid rabbanan de machayve. The rabbis are going to obligate. If the Beit Din said chaylev is permitted, and the Beit Din ate, just the Beit Din, there's no chiyuv. Hatanya, there's a braita that says, okay, in order to be paralel davar shel tzibur, there's certain basics. Okay, you need yachol. Okay, let's start with the question. Yachol holu Beit Din v'asu Beit Din yachol yu chayvim. You might have thought if the court rules and the court acts upon it, they're responsible to bring a korban. Talmud lomar hakahal v'asu. The pasuk teaches you it's the community that does it, which teaches you ma'aseh taloi b'kahal, Everybody has their role here. The ruling has to be by the court. If people on their own ruled, you're not going to bring a parlem devar shel tzibur. If the court did, but not the people, you're not going to bring it either. You need, number one, the court's ruling. Number two, the majority of the people acting. So huru va'asu, the rabbis or machayev, a korban, can't possibly be the beitin and the beitin. Not possible. Okay. Ella, huru beitin. Okay, everyone, obviously huru is the beitin. Nobody can argue with that. The question is just who did. Huru beitin, what's the other alternative? Asu rov hakahal, the majority of the people do it. Okay, fit that in and tell me what's wrong. If the beitin taught and the people did, then that's parhalem davar shel tzibor classic case. So what does that mean? How does Rabbi Meir exempt? Right? My tamid Rabbi Meir de potel. There's zero reason for that. Is the case where you're obligated parhalem davar shel tzibor. So what must it be? Now I want you to understand. In all except for one of the interpretations of this braita, the chayav and patur are going to relate to the parhalem davar shel tzibor. In this one attempt, though, we're going to say maybe it's talking about an individual sin offering. Elalav, maybe it is. Now remember, it says horu va'asu, so it has to be plural. It's not a singular individual person. But horu beitin va'asu mi'ut kahal. Now this is perfect. This is what we're looking for. The beitin taught, the people did, but what kind of people? Well, it can't be the majority. They'd be obligated for sure. Must be the minority. And what do you see here? Patur, chayav, there's your machloket. That's the machloket. Mar savar yachid shasa b'horat beitin patur, umar savar yachid shasa b'horat beitin chayav. Right? One opinion holds, if you do it b'horat beitin, that's Rabbi Meir, you're exempt. An individual, remember, individual and minority are all one and the same. As long as we're not up to majority, each person of that minority is an individual. Each one has to bring a korban. And Rabbi Meir says you don't, and the rabbis say you do, and there's your machloket. Perfect. Except it's not perfect, because as I said, we're going to have 4 other possibilities about what these words mean. And like I said, they're all going to relate to something else, because remember, there's a lot of words missing here. They don't really tell you very much. So we're going to be able to create other things, and they're going to have source in, they're going to relate them to other opinions that we see somewhere else, and then say, oh, that must be what this braita is talking about, something we've seen from a different braita. So Amar Rav Papa, de kule alma, first rejection, kule alma yachid she'asa b'hora'at beitin patur. Everybody agrees an individual who follows a unique ruling of the court is exempt, like our Mishna. Okay? I don't accept this. By the way, notice, I just caught this down. This is Rav Papa, who also tried to reject the previous one. Right? He did not believe that there's this opinion that everybody has to bring. Ela beitin mashlim l'rov tzibor kamiflagei. Let's go back to saying it's the court. Beitin horu, beitin asu. Now, what we say? Well, there's no paralem davar shel tzibor. But what if beitin asu together with the people? And let's say we're 50% of the population, okay, we're right around there, hovering around there. With the 3 judges, that puts us at the majority. Without the 3 judges, it doesn't. Are you chayav a korban? Is there a parhalem davar shel tzibor chiyuv or not? That's the machloket. Are the beitin mashlim l'rov tzibor? Do we count them as the people also, or are they not in the count? Mar savar beitin mashlim l'rov tzibor. The rabbis say they count, and therefore you'll be obligated. Meaning the court will be obligated because there's a parhalem davar shel tzibor obligation. And Mar savar ein beitin mashlim l'rov tzibor. And the other opinion, Rabbi Meir, who says they're exempt. There's an exemption from the parhalem davar shel tzibor here, because the beitin doesn't count in the count, and now you're at a minority. Ibai tema, another possibility. Horu beitin va'asu rubo shel kahal. Okay, now what if horu beitin, and then asu rubo shel kahal, and then the rov of the kahal follows. Uman chachamim, Rabbi Shimon hi da'amar tzibor maite ubeitin maite. We're now back to option 2. The beitin did, the people followed, right? The beitin, ruled, the people followed. We said, well, how could you possibly exempt? So now we're going to learn the exemption doesn't mean there's no parhalem davar shel tzibor. Of course there's a parhalem davar shel tzibor. The question is the community exempt? Meaning, we said before, there's machloket who brings the korban. So now we're going to say Rabbi Meir says the community is exempt because the beitin brings the korban. The rabbis who say they're obligated is Rabbi Shimon's position. That's why I said we're going to connect this to other machlokot we know of. De'amar tzibor maite ubeitin maite. According to Rabbi Shimon, the community has to bring, right? We saw before, either the community or the beitin. He has a combination position. Community has to bring, and the beitin has to bring. So the one who says chayav means the tzibor has to bring in addition to the court, and the one who says patur means just the beitin brings, not the community. And that's a totally different machloket. Ibai Dema, another possibility. Third one, Shevet Sha'asa B'Hora'at Beit Dino. Now, until now, we've been talking about majority of the people. And we saw 7 tribes. That's the majority of the Jewish people. Now we're going to learn that there's an opinion that it also counts for one tribe within itself is like a whole entire community. And therefore, if one tribe's court rules for them, a mistaken ruling, and that tribe follows, according to Rabbi Yehuda, they bring a parhalim davar shel tzibur. So what this is talking about, Huru v'asu, Huru, the Beit Din of this one unique shevet, and Asu, they followed, right? Their community followed them, their shevet, the majority of their tribe. So, Man Chachamim, Rabbi Yehuda hi Tanya. Rabbi Yehuda says, Shevet sha'asa b'hora'at Beit Dino, oto shevet chayav. Okay, that shevet has to bring. By the way, they disagree with him on 2 counts. The ones who disagree, number 1, it's not considered community, everyone. And also, it's not a parhalim davar shel tzibur, according to many, unless the decision was made in the big Sanhedrin of 71. And this is obviously not. This is a local one. Okay, Ibai Tema, a 4th possibility and final one. Okay, for this you have to know about the Electoral College as a good example. What if there's 6 tribes, so you don't have a majority of tribes, but population-wise, they're the majority of the community. Or you have 7, but they're, right, so majority of tribes, but not majority, if you count numbers, of population. And that's the case they're arguing about. And who does the rabbi's position hold with? Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. He did Tanya. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Omer, Mishmo. Mishmo, by the way, is the name of Rabbi Meir, which would be interesting, because then Rabbi Meir, and then the rabbis who disagree is someone who says in the name of Rabbi Meir, there's a debate, I guess, about what Rabbi Meir said. Okay, and there we have another machloket, that we could say maybe that machloket. So what we basically did is we superimposed other machlokot that we know about into this one, saying, who's to say the braita is talking about our case? And like I mentioned, in all the cases, other than the one that we were trying to use to prove it, the korban that you're chayav or patur is the parhalim davar shel tzibur and not the individual sin offering. Amar Rav Asi, new halacha, now new topic. Ubahora'ah halacha charov yoshvei Eretz Yisrael. Who's the rov? Rov of the Jewish inhabitants in Israel. Shenemar, where do we get it? From a pasuk of Shlomo HaMelech, when he did the Chanukat Beit HaMikdash, the consecration of the new temple. It says, Vayash Shlomo B'etei Chag, they celebrated the Chag, Sukkot, V'cho Yisrael Imo, Kahal Gadol, okay? All the people were with him, a huge Kahal, from Levo Hamat ad Nacham Mitzrayim, which are the borders of Israel. Lifnei Hashem Lokenu, Shivat Yamim, Shivat Yamim, it was for 7 days, another 7 days, 14 Yom. It already said all the Jews were with him, a Kahal Gadol. Why did they have to say where they all came from in the borders of Israel? Shma mina, hani who did Kahal, val hanach lo ikre Kahal. Let's teach you, Kahal is defined by Jews who live in the country of Israel. Okay, this isn't to offend anyone who doesn't, right? This is for the laws of parhalim davar shel tzibur. That's what we count a Kahal as. Pshita. Okay, now we're going to move on to something else. And we're going to compare it to a machloket that's going to come up later in the Masechet. To make things easier, I'll tell you about the machloket first. Rabbi Shimon and the rabbis have a debate. Now, I mentioned yesterday, which we didn't get into yet, but there's a special korban the Nasi brings if the Nasi sins or the Kohen. Let's say we have a case, I'll just take the Nasi, for example, who they define as a king. A king sins when they're an individual, before they became king. Then they find out they made a mistake. This is not an erroneous ruling of the court, this is their own personal. They made a mistake. Then they realize later, once they're already king, that they made the mistake. So now the question is, look, they sinned when they were an individual. So on one hand, you could say they bring the individual sin offering. On the other hand, there's 2 elements to it. It's the sinning and it's the finding out that you sinned and realizing your mistake. When the realization the mistake happened, he was already king. When you're king, you have a totally different obligation. So the rabbis say it goes by the sin. You sinned, you're an individual, you bring an individual sin offering, even though now you're a king. Rabbi Shimon says you have to have the sin and the knowledge of the sin happening at the same status. So he actually says something radical here. This kind of case, you don't bring a korban at all, because you have to have both happening at the same time, because we follow also when we know about the sin. So therefore, since you can't bring both, right, you're nowhere. So you actually don't bring a korban at all. So now they're going to bring a comparable case and say it's the exact same machloket. What if, in the parhalim davar shel tzibur case, they were mirubim, the people who sinned were the majority, and then let's say a bunch of them died before they brought the sacrifice, vinit ma'atu, and now they no longer compromise the majority when it's time to bring the korban. Hainu plukta de Rabbi Shimon v'Rabbanan. It's the exact same machloket. Because rabbis say we follow the time of the sin. They were the majority, you bring the korban. Rabbi Shimon says, but when they found out they were in a different status, you don't bring. Right? Because there's no chiyuv now. But now they ask the reverse. What if it was muatin v'nitrabu? What if when they sinned, they weren't the majority? And then some people died who didn't sin, and they became the majority. Mi pligi Rabbi Shimon v'Rabbanan. Rabbi Shimon, the Azar Batar Yediyah Machayev. If Rabbi Shimon says it's all important when you found out, well, when you found out, they were the majority. And Rabbanan, the Azar Batar Chata Patre, and the rabbis who say it all goes by the sin. Well, there was no obligation when they sinned because they were the minority. Ola, or maybe you don't. My, which is, well, I said something that's not exactly accurate, or the Gemara did, okay? Which is, they said Rabbi Meir says it's all about when you find out, but that's not true, and that's what the Gemara is going to say. V'tizbra, there's no way you could say that Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Shimon, that we argue here that Rabbi Shimon would say you'd be obligated because now that we found out you're the majority. Because imor deshamat Rabbi Shimon da'azal af batar yediyah. Rabbi Shimon doesn't say it's only important when you find out, and since now they're the majority, therefore you would have to. He says you have to have, it's also, you have to take that into consideration. You need them both to be at the same stage. If the sin happened when no one was obligated, and it's also, it's a crazy, of course the sin happening is very important. You can't ignore that. If the sin happened and there was no obligation of a korban, there's no way later now, all of a sudden you became the majority, we're going to be mechayev you. No one ever heard of, oh, I found out I sinned, but I didn't really sin because the sin really wouldn't have obligated me. Now I have to bring a korban? That would be ridiculous. Dim kain le'tikiyashta, and then go back to the nasi. If it really all mattered, the yediyah, what would we say? Not that the nasi is completely exempt. The nasi would have to bring the nasi korban, because now the korban, he's a nasi. That's not what he says. El Rabbi Shimon chata'av yediyah, he really needs both, and therefore you can't say this. Okay. I'm going to zip through this next section because it's kind of simple and we have not a lot of time. This next section is all sorts of things can they combine to obligate us in a parhalim davar shel tzibur. So we buy them. They start asking, and all the questions are going to end in teku. Horu beitin chelev mutar. They said chelev is permitted. V'asum mi'ut kahal, but only the minority followed. V'chazru beitin bahem, and then they realized their mistake. They changed. Okay, they said, "Oh, sorry, mistake. No obligation of a korban because it was only the minority." But then horu v'asum mi'ut acher. But then they taught it again by mistake. And then another minority of people did it, and if you count these two minorities, you end up with a majority. If since in the end they were broken by this, oh, we made a mistake for the realization, and then there was another realization, maybe you can't combine them. Or maybe since they did the same sin both times, the exact same thing, maybe you could combine them. And if you're going to say, well, they're both chelev, so let's just join them together, and yes, you're obligated korban. Here's another question. It's pasuk in Vayikra, which talks about when you burn them on the altar, but the same ones that burn on the altar are the ones that are forbidden. It mentions in Vayikra Gimel that there's two different types of chelev. So what if some ate one piece of type of chelev by mistake, and one ate another piece without any knowledge and understanding in between? Do we say, since they're both learned from two different parts of the same pasuk, but two different phrases, maybe you can combine them. Or maybe, look, this is chelev, that's chelev. Okay, so that part of the chelev from the animal, this different part of the chelev from the animal, but at the end, they're both chelev. And if you want to say, right, if you want to say, means we don't know the answer, but if you're going to say, yeah, chelev, let's just put them together. What if they taught two different things? Dam and chelev, and minority went by the dam ruling, minority ate the chelev by mistake. Hachavadai ditrei isurin. Chelev and dam are two totally different isurin. The kevan de ein isuran shaveh lo mitzdarif, and since they don't have the same prohibition, no. O dilma kevan de korbanan shaveh mitzdarif, but in the end you bring a chata for both of them, so maybe they would. The imtin tzalomar kevan de korban shaveh mitzdarif. Look, the korban is the same, so maybe yes. But what about miyub b'chelev and miyub avodat kochavim? We're going to learn that the avodat kochavim is a separate korban, a different korban chata for avodah zarah. So what if a minority did chelev, minority did avodah zarah? Vadai ein isuran shaveh ve'ein korbanan shaveh. It's not the same prohibition. It's not the same korban. Odilma kevan di'idividi kared hu mitzdarif. But they're both kared in the end, and they have a chatat offering. Maybe they do. Teku. We don't have an answer. One last question here in this section. The Beit Din rules, minority follows, and then the Beit Din dies. Those judges die. A new Beit Din comes, rules the exact same thing, and and another minority follows them. So now we have same ruling, two different courts though, and a majority of people doing it all together. Look, if you say the court's the one that brings the korban, of course we have no question, and of course you wouldn't bring a korban because the Beit Din's halit new. They're not alive anymore. So you can't say, well, the second Beit Din, we're going to obligate you also on what the first Beit Din did. Our question is, demanda amar tzibor maite, mai. If you say, though, the community has to bring it, do we combine the two communities? Tzibor hakai, the tzibor is in existence. Okay, finally getting to Amud Bet here. Odilma yediyadahu Beit Din deholu be'inan. Or do you need, though, what's an important element we keep talking about is the realization. Do you need a realization of each court? And the first court never came to a realization because they were dead before they realized their mistake, and maybe you wouldn't be obligated. Teku. End of discussion. We don't have an answer. Amar Rabbi Yonatan, new halacha. This is one of those examples which we've seen in other cases, for example, the Sota, where the rabbis come up with certain criteria that make it almost impossible for this halacha to ever exist. Okay, in this case, it's going to be Rabbi Yonatan, and he's going to basically say, I'll read it already, 100 people sat to court. Okay, remember we said it's usually the court of 71. How could you get to 100? Well, sometimes if you remember, we learned in Sanhedrin, they add judges, right, for various, if they can't come up with any, a unanimous majority decision. So let's say that, and the Gemara loves to use these extreme examples of using the number 100. Let's say you had 100 judges, doesn't matter how many, but let's say you had 100. You're not going to have a Paralim Davar Shel Tzibur ad shiru kulam, until they all unanimously agree. Okay, you ever see a court of 100 judges all agree on something? No way, no how, right? So this is going to make this halacha almost obsolete. Now, in the end, what we're going to do here is we're going to first prove his position, like show it a source in the Torah. We're going to bring 3 sources that contradict. The third one is going to be, we're not going to have a way to resolve it, and we're going to reject him, and then we're going to go back and say, well, then what do you do with that pasuk that he used to prove it? Okay, that's our structure here. Shene'emal, here's his proof. Im kol adat Yisrael yishku. Okay, in the psukim there it says, the whole nation. Ad sheyishku kulam. Now, how could you possibly have a case where everybody makes a mistake? It's a bit of a jump. Ad shetifshot hora'ah b'chol adat Yisrael. The only way would be is if it spreads completely, which means that every single judge is saying it. Okay, that's his proof. Amar Rav Huna b'rei Rav Oshaya hachinami mistaber. So first we have his proof. Now we're going to have that was where I get it from the pasuk. Now we're going to have someone who comes to support what he says. This is also a bit of a hard proof to understand, but it says in general we say rov is like as if you have everyone, right? We say this all the time, right? Majority is like everything. But ha-chaktiv, and therefore you wouldn't need this pasuk to say what it says. The pasuk here says kol adat should be kol adat, which is what we just read. Kol adat Yisrael. Now it could have just said adat Yisrael. Adat Yisrael means the community. The community means the majority. So why does it say kol? It must be to add ho'il v'kach afilu he mea. It must mean every single person, even if there are 100. So and every person again means every judge. Okay, and that's a further proof. But now here come our difficulties. We're going to do one after the other. First one is from our Mishna. Tnan. Hulu beitin v'yada achad mehem sheta'u. O tamid v'ro'oi lahora'ah. V'halach v'asal piem. We have a case where the judge himself knows it's a mistake, or the student, and anyway they follow the court. Ben shasu v'asai mehem, ben shasu v'asa acharem, ben shalo asu v'asa, right? Those 3 possibilities, how they could do it. Harei ze chayav. Why? Mipnei shalo talav beitin, because this person doesn't depend themselves on the court. They have their own unique, right? They are the court. Now, here comes the big inference. Ha-hu de chayav. Now, in that kind of a case, he would be chayav. But if someone else followed the ruling of the court, when this one judge dissented, you'd say what? Ha-acher, patur. They'd be exempt. Why would they be exempt? Because they followed the court, right? And if it was, now the assumption is, right, amai, halonig mara hora'ah. This is a case of following a hora'ah of the court, right? Now, hora'ah of the court could mean the tzibur has to bring the paralim davar shel tzibur, or an individual followed the court and is exempt. Either which way, it's because there was a hora'ah of the court. Now, what Rabbi Yonatan said, it's not considered hora'ah of the court unless they're all unanimous. Now, in this case, they weren't unanimous. One guy disagreed. So it doesn't make any sense. Here's the answer. It's a case where he disagreed with them, but he kind of just nodded his head like, fine, I'll go with you because we have to follow majority and I'll be with you, but I don't really agree with you. So in the end, you could say nigmara hora. There really was a hora because it was unanimous. And this you could see, you could get to unanimous because the dissenting opinions just sort of go with it. We're going to do the same thing with the second source. Tashma. One knows there's a mistake and he says, you're mistaken. Hare elu p'turim. Then everyone's exempt. That's not a paralim davar shel tzibur. Tama, but what do you notice here? He has to say the words, you are mistaken. Tama da'amar lehem to'im atem dipturim. That's when there's no paralim davar shel tzibur because they got up vocally and said, you are wrong. Hashatik mishtak. What if he just disagrees and doesn't say anything publicly or maybe at all, but just disagrees? Then it's not unanimous, right? He doesn't vote with them. Chayavim. It sounds like you'd be chayav, because only if you say to'im atem. V'gamar lahara. It sounds like it's complete, even though the person dissented. Amai, halahu kulam. But according to Rabbi Yonatan, said they didn't all agree. Amrei hachanami kegon shirkim b'rosho. Again, we're going to say, he nodded his head, like, I'll go with you, even though I disagree. Mativ ram misharshi. But here comes the third and final blow. Samchu rabotenu al divrei Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel ve'al divrei Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Tzadok. The rabbis relied on Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel and Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Tzadok shayom brim. Okay, this is the topic of Din Daf this week, a fascinating topic. It should go up later today. Ein gozling zera letzibur elen ken rov tzibur yicholim la'amod ba. We don't make a gzera on the community unless the majority of the community. Now, notice the word here: majority of the community can stand up to it. V'am Rav Adbar Abba Ma'ikra. What's the source for this? B'meirad. We saw this in Avodah Zarah. B'meirad tem ne'arim v'oti atem kovim agoy kulo. It's a pasuk in Malachi, which is reprimanding the people for not giving the trumot masrot to the people they're supposed to give them to, the tithes. It says b'meirad tem ne'arim. You accepted upon yourself. This is Gzera. They accepted upon themselves to give out the trumot masrot. That you'll be cursed if you don't do it. And yet, oti atem kovim, and yet you're stealing from me, God says to them. You're stealing from me by not giving them. Hagoy kulo. Now, the way they understand Hagoy Kulo, you accepted this as a complete nation, everybody. Now, dichtiv Hagoy Kulo, viruba kekula dami. So, what do they say here? This was a gzeirah that they all accepted. All means most, meaning that the reason they wouldn't have. Now, there's a little bit of a weird proof, but they wouldn't have taken on the gzeirah if people couldn't have stood up for it. No, they couldn't have handled it. And that proves to you, it's a bit of an interesting source because in the end, the people aren't doing it, but it seems like at least it's a little ironic because in the end, God's complaining that the people aren't, or the prophet complains that people aren't keeping it. But it sounds like when they did the gzera, it was done by the whole nation, meaning everyone was willing to accept it, and that's when you can do a gzera. So anyway, this is a whole topic in and of itself. We don't have time today, but the point is tiyuvta to Rabbi Yonatan tiyuvta, because what do you see here? It's the rov, right? Even if they don't all agree, okay? So here you see it doesn't work. So now, okay, so Ela mai kol adat kamar rachmana. So what's this kol adat? Hachi kamar. So now go back to the original pasuk. He said kol means everybody. What do you do with that? Ika kulam hav yehora. Bilo lo hav yehora. They all have to be there. They don't have to all vote, yes, but they all have to be there when the hora happened. This is like, right, when you pass a bill, do you have to have, or in the Knesset, you have to have them all there at the time? No, right? You can pass a bill even if people aren't there. They always use that to get bills passed, right? Do it when no one's there and then, we got a majority. Here it's saying, no. Pass in a majority when everybody's there. Okay, they have to be there. Amar Rabbi Yeshua, 10 people sit. Okay, here now we talk about responsibility of leaders. And this is a topic that's going to come up a lot in our Masechet. It's all about responsibility of leaders. If you sit 10 people who sit to judgment, it's like they're a thing hanging on their neck that could kill them, meaning there's a lot of responsibility upon you. Gemara says, Pshita, okay, I don't need you to tell me that. It's to tell you, even a student sitting there, when they're doing the judgment, they have a right to speak up if they think something's being done wrong. You have a serious level of responsibility. Now, here we're going to go in a bit of a different direction. It starts off very, very heavy. Rav Huna, when he would go to court, he would bring 10 students from the Beit Midrash of Rav with him. To take out some of the chips of wood from the big block. He wanted to lower his level of responsibility. To do that, he brought lots of people, and then it's equal responsibility upon all of them, and that lowers the level of responsibility upon him. And Rav Asi, when he had a treifa, and he wanted to know, like, is this kosher or not kosher? Is it a treifa animal? He would bring 10 butchers from Matamachasia, umotiv kamei, and he would sit before them. Okay, he wanted to make sure to ease the level of responsibility on him. So it starts up very strong, and then it says, well, there are ways to kind of, but yet you have to view yourself as completely responsible. Okay, new Mishna. Horu Beit Din. We made mention of this yesterday. The court rules. They realized they made a mistake. Doesn't matter if they brought the parlim davar shel tzibur, they didn't bring the parlim davar shel tzibur. But then this one guy never heard about the mistake, and he goes and acts upon the original mistaken ruling. Rabbi Shimon potil for Rabbi Lazar Omer safek. Rabbi Shimon says he doesn't have to bring a korban because why? He relied on the court. Rabbi Elazar says it's a safek. What does it mean, safek? Well, we don't know. Maybe he did it because he was relying on the court. Maybe he did it. Maybe he did know about it. We don't really know. Maybe he did it on his own. So what do you do in a safek case? If you're not sure you're supposed to bring a chatat, you bring what's called an asham taloi. So he obligates a korban, asham taloi. It's a provisional guilt offering, just in case. Ezehu safek. What's the safek? Yashav lo betoch beito. Okay, so when is there a case of safek? If he was yashav betoch beito, chayav. He obligates a korban Rabbi Elazar if you were living in your house still. Okay, you were there, you could have found out, and that's why we don't know. But if you were abroad and there was no communication, patur, then you're exempt because you had no way of knowing. And then even Rabbi Elazar will exempt, and then there's no machloket. Amar Rabbi Akiva, this is mostly in the same, we just have a conversation, Rabbi Akiva ben Azai, kind of similar to Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon. Amar Rabbi Akiva, modani b'zeshu karov l'ptur min hachiyuv. I tend to say like Rabbi Shimon, he's exempt. Amar lo ben Azai, Mishna. Okay, he's talking about specifically when he's away. Okay, I would exempt when he's away. Mishna zemina yoshev bebeito. Ben Azai says, why is this different than the guy sitting in his house? Very obviously, sheyoshev bebeito. Efshar haya lo sheyishma. Zet lo haya efshar lo sheyishma. The one sitting at home could have heard. The one who was abroad couldn't have heard about it. Okay, Horu Beit Din. Now we get to a totally different halacha. Horu Beit Din la'akor kol haguf. When you obligated parhalim davar shel tzibur. Now, what if they say there's no mitzvah at all of something, like there's no isur chelev? Amru, or here they give much bigger examples than chelev. Ein nida b'Torah. There's no nida in the Torah. Ein Shabbat b'Torah. Ein avodat kochavim b'Torah. Hare elu pturim. Okay, if they say there's no Shabbos, there's no idol worship, there's no parhalim davar shel tzibur. That's not what we're talking about here. If they just say something so completely absurd. Horu levatel miktzadu lekayem miktzat. But if they say there is such a thing, just you don't have to do it in this way. Hare elu chayavim. Ketzad. Amru yesh nida v'Torah aval abal shomer yabam yom keneged yom patur. If you sleep with a woman who's a zava ketana, I'm not going to get into what this is right now, but you'll be exempt. That's a side point. Okay, it's still a doraita isser, but okay, and that's why there's a parhalim davar shel tzibur. They make an erroneous ruling. Yesh Shabbat b'Torah aval motzim reshut echila reshut harabim patur. It's one detail of it, right? If you take something from the public domain to the private domain, you're exempt. That's wrong. And if they teach you that and you do it, parhalim davar shel tzibur. Yesh avodat kochavim b'Torah aval mishtachaveh patur. But if you bow, you're exempt. Hare elu chayavim shneimar v'ne'elam davar v'lo kol haguf. And they learn this from ne'elam davar. This is what it says in the psukim there, where something eluded them, something, but not the whole thing. Okay, now we're going to get started quickly with the Gemara. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. My tamet Rabbi Shimon ho ilabur should Beit Din oseh, because he was doing it based on the court. Ikeda Amrei. There's some who say a different version. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. Omer haya Rabbi Shimon kol hora'ah sheyatza berov tzibur yachid ha'oseh oto patur lefi shelo nitna hora'ah ela lavchin ben shogeg lemezid. This is a very interesting statement. The reason why we have the ruling of the court allows us to know whether people are shogeg or mezid, because as soon as the court rules it's permitted, we can assume anyone who did it because they heard it was permitted. And then they're not considered mazid. And that's why Rabbi Shimon's going to say, this guy's exempt because you heard the court say it, and therefore it's obvious he did it because of the court ruling. Even though the court changed their mind, we can assume he didn't hear. Meitiv. Okay, so that's what Rav says. Now we're going to have a difficulty on him. With this, we'll finish up. Meitiv. Parleim davar shel tzibur sirei avodat kochavim b'tchila govin alehem. Divrei Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Yehuda omer mitrumat halishkayim ba'im. Okay, so Rav basically said, okay, that, right, he's obviously acting on behalf of the court. But then there's this machloket. How do they collect the money for the parhalim davar shel tzibur? So according to Rabbi Shimon, they go knocking door to door. And according to the Rabbi Yehuda, they take it from the public funds. So now we have a problem, because if Rav is right, if they collected door to door and he lived in the city, how could Rabbi Shimon say he's exempt? He didn't know. Of course he knew. They knocked on his door and they said, we need money for the Parlim Davar Shel Tzibur, for the mistake. Something doesn't jive here. So 3 answers, and with that we'll finish. They knocked on your door and said, we need money. They didn't say for what. Maybe he wasn't in town when they collected the money. Or according to this version, maybe Rav had a different version of the braita, and Rabbi Shimon was the one who said they collected from the Beit HaMikdash, and that's why he wouldn't have known. Okay, quick review of our daf. We started with the 2 opinions of Shmuel, either Machloket Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Meir, or Rabbi Yehuda the rabbis, or Rabbi Meir and the rabbis. We tried to find, we had the braita for the first one, but we didn't have a good braita proof for the second one. In the end, we had 4 different ways of reading that braita, and perhaps that's not the Machloket. We then dealt with what's Rov of Yisrael in Israel. Merubim v'nitma'atu is the same Machloket Rabbi Shimon and the rabbis. What if it was the reverse? No, there's no Machloket. We had all those questions of 2 things combining. We have Rabbi Yonatan with the 100, you need unanimous. We rejected him. And then we ended with the responsibility of the judges. And from there we went to a case where they figured their mistake, but one person didn't. And tomorrow we're going to see 2 more opinions about what we do in a case like that. With that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day.